Hi class, in this Edpuzzle we are talking about motivation and emotion, and we are going to start with motivation, and then in the next video we'll be doing emotion. So what is motivation? Motivation is the wants or needs that direct behavior towards a goal. Your motivations can be intrinsic or extrinsic. If they are intrinsic, they arise from internal factors, and if they're extrinsic, they arise from external factors. An example of an intrinsic motivation would be if you go running because you love how it feels to run. Extrinsic motivation would be if you go running because you want to get under 25 minutes on a 5K next month. There's an external reward versus an internal drive for it. An experiment connected with this that looked at whether it was okay to add extrinsic motivation if there was already intrinsic motivation used kids, because generally it's better to have intrinsic motivation. For example, if you are trying to do well in school, it's a whole lot easier to do well if you just really love studying that subject. It's a little harder to keep that momentum going if you're only studying because your parents promised you a new phone if you got at least a B. If you love it, it's easier to do. So intrinsic overall is better than extrinsic. But what happens if someone has intrinsic motivation and you put extrinsic over top? Is it okay to add extrinsic motivation when there's already intrinsic motivation? So for this experiment with kids, they found kids who during free time at school would draw. So if it's your free time and you're doing it, that means that's intrinsic motivation. So these kids had an intrinsic motivation to draw. And then they were divided into three groups. One group was the control group, so nothing, just live your life during the experiment. Another group was told, if you draw during free time this next week, you're going to get a prize. So that's extrinsic motivation being added. And then the third group wasn't told anything. However, if they chose to draw during free time, at the end of the week, they were given a prize. And so one group control, another group, they were given extrinsic motivation. So on top of that, intrinsic. And then that third group, the one that got the surprise prize, that was the prize, but it wasn't extrinsic motivation because they didn't know they were going to get it when they were drawing that week. It was just because. So out of those three groups, my question for you is, when the people returned, when the researchers returned later on, what groups were still drawing during free time? What groups had that intrinsic motivation still to draw? So mark all the ones that apply. So it is everyone but the people that had, the kids that had extrinsic motivation. If you have intrinsic motivation and you add extrinsic motivation on top, it is possible that the intrinsic motivation goes away. The intrinsic motivation kind of dies. That is the overjustification effect. It's when intrinsic motivation is diminished when extrinsic motivation is given. So the control group didn't have that because they never got extrinsic motivation, and the group that had the surprise prize also did not have extrinsic motivation because it was a surprise at the end. It was just the group that had that extrinsic motivation that was told, if you draw, you get a prize. They stopped drawing during free time. They lost that intrinsic motivation. Now, other studies have shown that intrinsic motivation is not that vulnerable to the effects of extrinsic motivation. There's a few sort of caveats. One is praise as an extrinsic motivation does not necessarily decrease intrinsic motivation. It can actually potentially increase it. It's the tangible rewards, like in this experiment, that are more detrimental to intrinsic motivation. And again, it's expectations. that are really important. You can give prizes for things. It's not that if someone has intrinsic motivation, you're never allowed to reward them for their hard work, but make it a surprise. If they don't expect it, it's not going to affect their intrinsic motivation. The next thing to go over, we're going to go over a few theories of motivation. So the first one we're going to talk about is drive theory, and then we'll talk about self-efficacy and hierarchy of needs. So there's going to be 3 different theories of motivation. There are more theories than just these 3. These are just the ones we're going to focus on in this class. And there's even some more in your book, but these are the ones you need to know for this class. So the first, you got to know what an instinct is. That's a species-specific pattern of behavior that is not learned. And William James thought that behavior was driven, what motivates us to act, is instinct. Instincts that help us survive. But he was wrong. Instincts are not learned, which means if James was correct, nothing that motivates you is something that you can learn. You can't learn a motivation. And that's not true. Learning plays a role in shaping our behaviors. We can learn different behaviors and be motivated to do those behaviors. Like think about little Albert and his fear of the white rat. That was a conditioned fear response. He was motivated to cry at the sight of the white rat. That was definitely a learned behavior. That was not instinctual. Okay, so let's get into these theories that are actually kind of accurate, since James's instinct idea, not so much. Drive theory. A few definitions before we get into the basics of this. You need to know what homeostasis is. Homeostasis is the tendency to maintain a balance or optimal level within a biological system. We want to maintain a certain state. And so if there is an imbalance, if we are out of homeostasis, it's going to create a need, a physiological need within us. And that need, because we're not in homeostasis, is going to lead to drive states. So a drive is a pattern of behavior in which you regularly engage. You are going to want to act in a certain way. These drive states are going to direct your behavior so that you meet the need to bring the system back to homeostasis. So that's what drive theory says. If you're out of homeostasis, you are going to do a certain behavior to get you back into homeostasis. For example, if you are hungry, homeostasis would be not hunger. You are good. So if you have hunger, that is a physiological need. And so you are going to be driven to eat. So your drive is eating. And it can be other things as well. For example, if you're at a party and it's really loud and it's really hot and there's a lot of people, and so you feel kind of overwhelmed, like you're too hot, your senses are overloaded, you're gonna be out of homeostasis. And so what are you gonna do? You're gonna go outside, get away from the crowd, turn down the music. You're gonna do something to get you back into homeostasis, to sort of get you back to that optimal level. So that is what drive theory says. And an extension of drive theory is the Yerkes-Dodson law. Basically, there's this idea that you have this optimal level of arousal that you want to be at. Your best performance comes from a moderate level of arousal. When it comes to how well you are going to perform a task, moderate level of arousal is best. That is optimal for tasks. The Yerkes-Dodson law says that a simple task is performed best when arousal levels are moderately high. And for complex tasks, those are best performed when arousals are moderately low. Basically, it's this combination, when you're getting to this optimal level of arousal, how hard the task is plays a part in what level in that moderate arousal level is best. Is it moderately high or is it moderately low? So if you think about this, if you are, if it's an easy task, if it's something you've done a lot, you're good at it. If you up your arousal a little bit, like for example, have a crowd watch you, you're going to be better at it. If you're on a team here and you're a really good player, if you're in practice, you might not be trying as hard as when you're in a really important game. That really important game is going to up your arousal level. You might have a better performance. If it's something that's really hard, though, if it's something you're not very good at, then having people breathing down your neck while you're doing it, watching you do it, that's going to send your arousal too high. You're going to bomb the task. If it's something really hard, you don't want other stuff around. You want everything else to be quiet, to be chill, so that it helps decrease your arousal, so you're at that moderately low level. That's when your performance is going to be good. If something's really hard and there's all this extra pressure to increase your arousal, you're going to bomb it. So easy task, you want moderately high level of arousal for best performance. Difficult task, you want a moderately low level of arousal. The next motivation theory we're going to talk about is self-efficacy. This is Bandura's theory, Albert Bandura. And self-efficacy is your belief in your own capability to complete a task. And that what creates this belief is previous successful completion of that task or a similar task. So if you think you can do something, you're going to be motivated to do it. If you think you're not going to be able to do something, you're not going to be motivated to do it. That's what self-efficacy says. So Bandura's theory is that people's sense of self-efficacy plays a really important role in motivating behavior. So motivation comes from our expectations about the consequences of our behavior. Do we expect it's going to go well, or do we expect it to go horribly wrong? And so if we think we have the capability to do a certain behavior, then that will affect whether we do it right now, but it's also going to affect the future goals we set for ourselves. We're only going to be motivated to try to reach goals we think we're going to be able to accomplish. So that is the self-efficacy theory. The final theory we're going to go over before we go into a couple of examples of motivation actually affecting behavior is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So Abraham Maslow has his hierarchy of needs. And for the hierarchy of needs, there are levels for it. So your needs motivate you, generally speaking. And in general, you are going to start from the bottom and work your way up. So you have to meet the bottom needs, at least partially, before you start thinking about higher needs. And these are in reverse order. So this is 1, this is 2, 3, 4, 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So your first, most basic need is your physiological needs: food, shelter, water, warmth. If you're about to freeze to death, that's the only thing that's going to be motivating you. That's going to be your focus. Next is security needs. This is safety, employment, that sort of thing. You know you're going to survive. 3 is social needs. So this is family, friendship. Sometimes this is called belongingness. It's your need to feel like you belong, that people care if you are going to survive the night. The fourth level is esteem needs, and this is going to be things like self-worth, accomplishment. You not only want people to love you, you want them to be proud of you. You want to accomplish things. And then at the very top, you have self-actualization. And self-actualization is inner fulfillment. It is achieving your fullest potential. You could not be more awesome. And then Maslow has added a few more of these. One you need to know is self-transcendence. This is you're striving for meaning or purpose beyond concerns for yourself. It's basically trying to help other people become self-actualized as well. For example, someone that Maslow said was self-actualized was Gandhi. And so, you know, he's as awesome as he can be. And so he helps lead a whole movement in his country to get people their freedom. A more modern example, you could think of like Oprah. Can't get much more cool. And so she has her whole own network and her, I don't know, Super Soul Sunday or whatever that is. She does things to try to help other people achieve their fullest potential because she's kind of reached the pinnacle for herself. So again, you have to focus on the bottom before you go to the top. For example, when I was in Rwanda, I did a needs assessment with some heads of child-headed households. So after the genocide there were way too many orphans and not really many orphanages and not really a foster care system because most of the families that survived were from the group that tried to kill these kids. So like they don't want to take them into their home. So what happened is the orphans made their own families, and whoever was the oldest orphan would be the head of this child-headed household. And so most of my research was with that population, the heads of these households. And so the group I worked with, they were rural. So they were out in the country. Their lives were very difficult. When I did this needs assessment, a lot of the killers of the genocide were being released from prison. So they were now living near the people who had killed their families. Because they were the head of the household, they would stay and farm while the younger kids would go to school. So they were illiterate, no chance of a good job, barely surviving. They were making on average less than $1 a month. They were eating one meal a day. It was a very hard life. So the bottom of their pyramid was not being fulfilled. They were chronically hungry. They couldn't be sure they weren't going to be attacked by the killers that were being released. You know, they're orphans who are home all day alone farming. They're not going to accomplish much. So one of the questions I asked in this needs assessment was, in your ideal world, where would you be in 5 years, 10 years, and 20 years? Trying to get at this self-actualization. If you could be all you wanted to be, what would that be? And a significant portion of these orphans couldn't answer the question. They literally could not think, where am I going to be down the road? Because the bottom of their pyramid was not being met. They were too focused down here to think about lofty goals like, what do you want to be when you grow up? So generally speaking, the bottom has to be at least somewhat filled before you move up. I mean, if you skip breakfast in the morning, it's not like you can't think about studying at all. But if you never have breakfast because you can't afford it, then it might be harder to study. A couple of extra things to know, though. One is that more than one level of the pyramid can go into motivating a behavior. For example, if you go out to dinner Friday night with your friends, yes, you're thinking about physiological needs, you need to eat, but you're also thinking about social needs because you're hanging out with friends. So more than one need can motivate you. Also, there are exceptions to this rule. Occasionally, you focus at the top of the pyramid to the detriment of the bottom. For example, martyrs. They're dying, but they're doing it to reach their version of self-actualization. although it doesn't even have to be that extreme. For example, when I was in grad school, I didn't make a lot of money. I was making less than $20,000 a year living near Boston, which is not a cheap place to live. And I didn't want to take any loans. So I lived next to a house that sold drugs, and I got my food from a food pantry that I volunteered at. And I kept my heat in the winter at 45 degrees in my house. Froze a goldfish to death. And I would just keep my coat on all the time and drink hot water to stay warm. That was, I mean, I did not live in a safe neighborhood. I was not getting the best food. I was very cold, but I was doing it because I wanted to finish my PhD. I wanted to get out of school and to not have tons of debt. But I mean, because I was focused on trying to get food and stuff, like my furniture was all from Goodwill and was horrible. I wasn't thinking about aesthetics and fancy things. I was just trying to survive, but in order to get my degree. So you can mix it up in certain things in your life, but generally speaking, bottom has to be filled before you move up. And Maslow would say only about 10% of people actually reach self-actualization. Most of us are, I'd say none of us are probably self-actualized. But that is the hierarchy of needs. And that's it for the theories of motivation. What we're going to do is the last two things in this video. We're going to talk about a couple of things that motivate us. Hunger, we're going to talk about hunger, and then we're going to talk about sexual behavior, because they put them in this chapter. For hunger, Washburn is someone who studied hunger, and this isn't Margaret Washburn, this is a different Washburn, this is a man. He swallowed a balloon, and when he felt hungry, the balloon would contract. His stomach was contracting around the balloon. And so he thought, okay, stomach contractions are one of the things that cause that sensation of hunger. So he took a bunch of rats and took out their stomachs. And the rats would still try to eat. So he realized that stomach contractions can't be the only factor that motivate us to eat, that give us that sensation of hunger, because if that was true, the rats would never have tried to eat again. When we talk about this, satiation is that fullness or satisfaction feeling you have. That is sort of the opposite of hunger. So what we know are factors that contribute to whether you feel satiated or hungry. One is your glucose level. Glucose is a form of sugar that circulates in the blood and provides the major source of energy in the body. When your glucose level is low, when your blood sugar level is low, you are going to feel hunger. Your body releases insulin when you have sugar, and that insulin is going to lower the glucose level in your blood. So if you have a high carb diet, you're going to have more sugar in your blood, you're going to have more insulin released, you're going to feel hungry faster. So if you have a high carb meal, you won't feel full as long because of your glucose levels dropping after the insulin's released. Another factor is chemicals in your brain, hormones. You have ghrelin and you have leptin. These are released by the hypothalamus. The way I tell them apart is that ghrelin makes your hunger grow and leptin makes you lose your appetite. So ghrelin is the hunger arousing hormone and leptin is the hunger suppressing hormone. So, for example, there was a girl, she was about 12. She had to have brain surgery for a benign tumor in her brain, but when they took out the tumor, it damaged her hypothalamus, and so she was unable to release leptin. Her brain only released ghrelin. Basically, she felt like she was starving to death all the time. She was ravenous, and so she gained a potentially deadly amount of weight. She was well over 200 pounds at 12 years old, and she had to have gastric bypass surgery at 12 in order to help combat the ghrelin that was being released by her hypothalamus. Because your stomach does play a part in it, although there are other factors involved as well. Another factor is your metabolic rate. This is the amount of energy that is expended in a given period. Your basal metabolic rate is the amount of calories you burn, the amount of energy you need if you are just chilling on the couch each day. If you have a higher BMR, you will feel hungry more often because you will need more food. If it's lower, you don't need as many calories. One factor in what your BMR is what your set point is. The set point theory says that each person has an ideal body weight that's resistant to change. It's about a 5-pound range. And so if you try to significantly move your weight from the set point, your body is going to resist, and it's going to compensate for those changes by things like making you feel hungrier, lowering your BMR in order to get you back to that set point. So that is hunger. And the next thing connected with this is obesity and eating disorders, which also motivate you to eat or not eat. For obesity, there are certain levels. We use BMI to mark if you are overweight or obese. BMI is not always accurate. At a population level, it tends to be, but there can be individual differences. For example, if you have a high percentage of muscle, your BMI technically will be high. It does not mean you actually have a large percentage of fat on your body. It's just that muscle weighs more. And so yes, there are exceptions to BMI being accurate to tell you whether you are overweight or not. But we're going to discuss it for right now, because again, population-wide, it tends to be accurate, even if individually it's not always. If your BMI is between 25 and 29.9, so at least 25, under 30, you are classified as overweight. If your BMI is between 30 but under 40, you are obese. And if your BMI is 40 or above, then you are going to be morbidly obese. And so in the US, 1/3 of US adults are overweight, and 1/3 of US adults are obese or morbidly obese. So 2/3 of US adults fall somewhere in the overweight or obese category. So it is a significant issue for people in the US because of the increased risks for a variety of things if you are overweight or obese. So specifically for obesity, if you are obese, you are more prone to cardiovascular disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes, liver disease, sleep apnea, certain kinds of cancer like colon and breast cancer, infertility, and arthritis. So a significant number of issues connected with obesity. And so what causes obesity? What makes it more likely you will be obese? A part of it is genes. If your parents are obese, you are more likely to be obese. A part of it is environment. If the people around you are obese, you are more likely to be. Part of it is socioeconomic factors. People who are in lower socioeconomic range are more likely to be obese because cheaper food tends to be high calorie, high fat food, not as nutritious, more prone to leading to obesity. And then finally, your physical environment is a contributing factor. And so question for you, who is more likely to be obese? Someone who is in a rural environment or someone who is in an urban environment? It is the rural environment. And the reason for this is that if you live in a rural area, you're more likely to have to rely on a car. You're less likely to be walking because things are more stretched out there's not, a subway a half a mile from your house. You're going to hop in the car in your driveway and drive places. And so you are less likely to be getting physical activity during the day if you live in a rural area, because honestly, most people in rural areas are not farmers anymore. And so there's higher obesity levels in rural areas. Final thing connected with eating is eating disorders. There's a few you should know. Move me out of the way a little bit. You have bulimia. Bulimia is when you engage in binge eating behavior that's followed by an attempt to compensate for the large amount of food that is consumed. So you are going to purge by inducing vomiting or using laxatives, or by doing excessive amounts of exercise. So both of those can go along with that binge eating in bulimia. About 1% of women and half of 1% of men are bulimic. You can also have binge eating disorder. Binge eating disorder is the binging behavior, like with bulimia, but you do not have purging. Instead, it's followed by distress, feelings of guilt, embarrassment because of the binging behavior. And then you also have anorexia. Anorexia is the maintenance of a body weight well below average through either starvation or excessive exercise. This often comes with a distorted body image, which is a version of body dysmorphia. What that means is when you look at yourself in the mirror, you do not see what is actually there. So even if you are very thin, when you look in the mirror, you see someone who is significantly larger, who weighs significantly more. So you don't have an accurate view of yourself. There are a lot of negative health consequences connected with anorexia. You are more prone to bone loss, osteoporosis, heart failure, kidney failure, amenorrhea, which is a loss of your menstrual cycle, infertility, a reduced functioning of your gonads. That can be permanent damage, and it can kill you if you starve yourself long enough. This is more common than bulimia. About 1 to 4% of women are anorexic. It's less common in men. However, that is not a universal rate around the world. White women from Western societies are at higher risk of being anorexic versus women of color or women outside the West. And it is more common in younger women, people between 15 to 19. So that is it for eating and hunger. And I'm going to make this video the long one. The next one will be shorter, just so that this is all motivation and the next video is all emotion. So the final thing I'm going to talk about here is sexual behavior. We'll start with a discussion of Kinsey. And so Kinsey initiated a large-scale survey on the topic of human sexuality. He created a continuum called the Kinsey scale. It's still commonly used today to categorize someone's sexual orientation. And so on the scale, at one end, you have homosexual, you're attracted to people of the same sex. On the other end, you have heterosexual, attracted to people of the opposite sex. Dead center, you have bisexual, attracted to people of both sexes. But again, this is a continuum. You can be anywhere along this continuum. We have a few more orientations that have been developed since Kinsey first developed his Kinsey scale. For example, if you are pansexual, you are attracted to someone without regard for their sex or gender. Sex and gender are irrelevant to you. And if you are asexual, then you don't experience sexual attraction to people. In general, your sexual orientation, regardless of what it is your emotional and erotic attraction towards another individual. Anywhere from 3 to 10% of the population identifies as homosexual. That number has increased in recent generations. For a lot of years, people thought that differences in sexual orientation came from socialization, that it was your environment that led to your sexual orientation. This is not true. Research has consistently shown that family background and your experiences are very similar regardless of what your orientation is. There are a lot of factors that go into what someone's sexual orientation is. Genes play a part in it. For example, there is something called the fertile female hypothesis that says that there is a gene on the X chromosome, so it is a sex-linked trait, that increases attraction to men. So this is called the fertile female hypothesis because if women have this gene on their X chromosome, they're extra attracted to men, they are more fertile and reproduce more. So this gene will stay in the population. However, remember, men also have an X chromosome. And so if men get this gene, they are also more attracted to men. They are more likely to be homosexual. And so the female relatives of gay men tend to be more fertile. In general, genes account for at least half of our variability in human sexual orientation, but it's not just genes. One example of an environmental factor is through prenatal environment. For example, for men, this only is related to men who are homosexual. If the more older brothers your mother had before you, the more likely you are to be gay. Because when a woman is pregnant with a male fetus, there is now an X or a Y chromosome floating in her body, and her body, which only has XX chromosomes, identifies it as foreign and creates antibodies. And so every time there's a new male fetus in that uterus, more of these antibodies are created. These antibodies somehow contribute, at least partially, to a homosexual orientation. And so men who have a lot of older brothers are more likely to be gay. However, this is only true if you're right-handed. We're not sure why. Again, they continue to find more things that are contributing to sexual orientation, but it's not the way your parents treated you. It's not your environment. You come by it honestly. And then gender. Gender identity and sexual orientation are different things. Gender identity is your sense of being male or female. So for this, if your gender identity does not match what people assume your gender identity is, that is gender dysphoria. So if you don't identify as the gender that most people would assume you are, you have gender dysphoria. If you are going to be diagnosed with gender dysphoria, it has to last for at least 6 months, and it has to lead to significant distress or dysfunction. It has to be something that is affecting your everyday life. You also, if you're going to be diagnosed with this as a child, you have to be able to verbalize that you want to be the other gender. And you can be diagnosed with gender dysphoria from a very young age, and it tends to be something that sticks around. Over 95% of kids who are diagnosed with gender dysphoria by the age of 8 will continue to identify as a gender different from what people assume they are through adolescence. So this isn't something that tends to go away. It's something that tends to stay. And so this can lead to people being transgender, where they identify as the gender that they feel they are. And so you can go through a variety of treatments to help with this gender dysphoria if you are transgender. For example, transgender hormone therapy. You use hormones as well as hormone blockers to make your body look like the opposite sex, like the one you identify with, the one that you are. Just like with sexual orientation, your socialization does not cause you to be transgender. This is something that you are born with. Just like with sexual orientation, they're still figuring out what are the factors that can lead someone to be transgender, but how your parents raise you is not one of the factors that will lead to it. And one way we know this is through the research of Dr. Money. He, do I have, no, that's emotions. I don't have his name here, but it's Money. He did research with a child who, this child was a twin, born male. And when he was 6 months old, he and his twin brother were circumcised. Something went wrong with the procedure for him, and it burned off his penis. And this was back when they were much more comfortable doing surgery on infants, genital surgery, to make them look like the way the doctors and parents thought they should look. Now this does not happen. For example, if you are intersex, you show signs of both sexes. Now the standard procedure is to not do any procedures on the child, wait for their gender identity to develop, and then as they're older, help their bodies align with what their identity is. But this was back in the 80s, early 80s, they just did surgery. And so the doctors decided it would be better to raise him as a girl than as a boy with a disfigured penis. So they did surgery, made him look like a girl, and said, okay, now instead of Bruce, you're raising Brenda. And Dr. Money was sort of in charge of keeping an eye on him and doing research on his gender identity as Brenda was being raised, because Dr. Money had this, what he called the psychosexual neutrality theory, which is the idea that you don't have a gender identity at birth. It's your parents that give it to you through things like socialization, putting dresses on girls, giving trucks to boys. So Dr. Money said, just give Brenda lots of dresses and dolls and she'll be fine. She wasn't fine. By adolescence, found out that what had happened when he was a child, said, no, I never felt like a girl. I'm not a girl, I'm a boy. Transitioned back to being Bruce and tried to live a normal life, got married, had stepkids. However, he was not able to overcome all that trauma of trying to be forced into a gender that was not his as a child, and he ended up killing himself. And that's also one reason why transgender youths have a significantly higher rate of suicide attempts and suicides, because they're being forced potentially into a gender that is not the one they want to identify with. If you do gender confirming treatment for people who are transgender, it can significantly help decrease the number of suicides and suicide attempts. But through this research, very unethical research on Bruce by Dr. Money, and other research, we know you cannot force a gender identity onto somebody. And that is it for this video.